We are live in 3, 2, 1, go.
Here we go. Thanks, everybody. And good questions off the start. I think what we're seeing is that the more that gets added in, even though some of that conversion listed as preview right now may end up being a premium SKU of some kind, whether that means an E5 or whatnot. These are nice features to have baked in. And it's kind of what we'll do today. And it's funny because this started a couple of months ago really as a client request for a workflow that we'll step through once. Here's kind of off the top, and it'll give you the sense of kind of what the background is and how this all came about and what the solution looked like and then some things learned along the way. And then we'll look at a solution that I'll be sharing back with everybody so that you can use that as sort of a starting place or to pull into your own tenant and to get to take some ideas from. Also try to include a lot of those useful things right in the deck as much as possible, which we can also get rolling right away. Again, just so that you have a handy reference as we're going forward with this. Now, I'm going to be looking sort of in both directions as I'm working. I've got my team screen is where I'm looking right now with the camera, and then over here is where is where I see what you see, and that's where I'll probably spend most of the time today. I may just turn my camera off during that time. The other thing probably useful to preface this with is this really started as one of those things like a blog post like anything else, where it started off with an actual client requirement, and really what I wanted to do today was share a little bit about sort of those the last few weeks of kicking away at this and getting some different ideas along the way, and then turning that into some sort of a presentation. So this is a fairly considered a draft as we're going through. All the ideas are relatively complete. There'll be some questions that I may or may not be able to answer depending on how deep they go. But I'll at least be able to share the experience and hopefully save you 2 to 3 weeks of kicking tires at some of these possibilities also. And also to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that came up along the way in where this could go and where we could lead it. So without further ado, who am I? Most of you know me. Bill and I started this group a long time ago now. I don't even know how many years that would be. I feel free to grab my contact information, give me a shout if you're working through anything similar. And that's about all I need to go. Thanks to everybody also who came out for the boot camp a couple of weeks ago on the 27th of November. We had an awesome time, and really great feedback came from it. So thanks again for everybody here who was both involved in attending and organizing. So tonight we'll kind of tackle this in two pieces. Again, it's really to share the experience, and first of all, that's to take a look at where this all began and sort of an approach to having some kind of lifecycle management around Power Automate and also Power Apps for that matter, and just sort of so that you're able to create these solutions and then move them other places. Honestly, it's just about that portability so that you can have a dev environment, a test environment, a production environment, the way that we've all been taught to build things. And let's see how that can kind of work. So first of all, we'll kind of look at the client piece. We'll have a bit of a discussion about the solutions themselves. And then we'll take a look at a slightly simpler case where we'll get a little bit further into the weeds, and this will be the solution that I'll distribute for everybody to make use of as you like. Any questions before we get rolling? Any hands up? I don't see any questions in the chat. Feel free to use the chat for those questions, and then Peter, Bill, or anybody else will be able to raise a hand and let me know when there's something queued up. So this began as a request for the types of recurring tasks that Outlook is really not good at scheduling. Rather than just saying, on the first or second Tuesday of the month, the way that you would normally schedule meetings, this is really about scheduling deadlines for In this case, it was some regulatory work and some filings that have to be completed at certain times. It might be financial statements, it might be public statements, it could be a number of things actually, and it could even be just simply, here's our reporting periods, and this is when we need to have things done by. So what happened with this client and what kind of made it complicated was it wasn't just a single type, but they would have one-time events. They would have monthly events on a regular date, which is fairly simple. They would have annual events on an anniversary. They would have something's keyed off of the first of the month. Something's keyed off of a month end, where a month end might have to be a weekday. So it wasn't necessarily a last day of the month, but you have to count backwards from there to reach a weekday, or from the beginning of the month and moving forward. Maybe it's something that even needs to look up into a table somewhere, and or other things that you might think of being able to do would be things like currency conversions and web lookups. In this case, a lot of things were these recurring tasks were quarterly also, so they'd be similar to monthly in that they might be on the last weekday of the quarter or 16 days after the end of a quarter, and so needed sort of a language, a semantic language that would help them define these things. So that was kind of the basic idea as it was posed, and from there I wanted to create some sort of a process. So trying to break this down, the first idea was having a place where these things could be managed in some kind of a recurring task list, which is exactly what the result was. And then from there, once I've defined this thing, to have something that iterates over there every so often and says, hey, which of these needs to be, do I need to generate the next one of? And as those are generated, they would show up in a task list now. It could also be a planner task. It can be really anywhere that you want to keep a list of these things. But the basic idea was I just still wanted to use this as a data store, and I don't want any end users to actually have to come back to this thing. That was kind of the other thing, was every time, if you're even back to like on-prem SharePoint, whenever you have one of those workflows where somebody has to go to a place to mark something complete, it was very rare that they actually ever did that. And it's one of the reasons why workflow became kind of a dirty word in SharePoint land. So I want the interface in this case to be the calendar entry that actually shows up and here's the deadline. And then sometime prior to that, we want to send the user a reminder. In some cases, that'll be just 30 days ahead. So maybe it's a quarterly filing that just happens every 30 days. Maybe if it's a month end kind of due date, then we want to notify them on the 1st that, hey, this month you're working on such and such a thing, and it's got to be finished by the 3 days following month end. So the user interface is really this first piece, and these last two pieces, the calendar entry themselves and an email reminder. And so with that, next thinking was, well, first of all, that's fairly complicated to build, and I could stand up all these functions and build all this logic and sort of built a simple one that just did monthly anniversaries, or on the 15th of every month is fairly simple to drive. Annual on a certain day and month is pretty easy to build out. But then when you have combinations of these things and these, one of these, the periodicity, the frequency might be quarterly, or it might be annually. And in each of those cases, there'll be a modifier to say require a weekday, or we'll always have an assignee and a backup. So there are things that are common to them. There are things that are different to them. And for just about every one of these types of recurring frequencies, we're going to have different parameters for it too, which kind of further complicates it. And it doesn't take much to see that you're going to have several possible streams happening. And rather than start, figuring out how you might build, starting to layer up the complexity, it occurred to me that Excel has all the date functions anybody could possibly want. But we don't want to just do all the stuff in an Excel file, because we want to key the events off of it. We want to have that calendar entry. We want to have an email reminder. And actually in the email reminder, another thing that I thought would be nice would be to able to mark the item is complete right from that email. So again, I never have to leave. I never have to go and visit a site. I can just say, hey, this is done, and I want to mark it. Which also actually drove the choice to build this as a Power Automate solution and not as a Logic app. Now, it has been a few months since I built Logic app, my last Logic app, but I typically prefer those in almost every case for these ALM principles. There was a brief conversation as we were getting the meeting started with Peter, and sort of talking about the ability to deploy a Logic app with a credential that gets stored in a secure way, so that some your IT ops people can manage your solution and the code and the actual flow separately from the credentials that are required to the credentials that are used to run it, or the identity that it runs on behalf of. And with Logic apps, you can also have this nice segmentation of resource groups, so that you can have different billing codes for different resource groups, for example. Or it gives you the kind of granularity, and they've thought about those ALM pieces. But of course, it's an extra charge. It's an Azure service. And Logic apps are kind of the big brother in many ways to what Power Automate does within SharePoint. So but what they don't do is in these, its Outlook integration, it didn't have a nice implementation yet of, mark this item as complete, where I have some control over it. They have a basic approval, but since it's a Logic app and an Azure service, there seems to be a tacit assumption that the people who use and are participants in a Logic apps flow might not necessarily have an Office 365 account. So it seems like they didn't want to make that presumption that it would support what are called Outlook actionable messages. Versus if you belong to a company with an Office 365, M365 tenant, then you will be able to take advantage of actionable messages. And they do have a very nice UI even for building out those, and we'll take a look at that as we go along this. So the fact that I wanted the user feedback to happen from the email message also drove kind of the choice for doing this with Power Automate. And Excel seemed like a good place to write parameters and read output. It also makes a good scratch pad for figuring out how these calculations are going to work. And finally, we want to have some kind of an event log, which is just a good idea anytime you have anything of more than absolute simplicity, so that if things go wrong, you have a place to go back and have a sense of where that might have happened for your debugging processes, and as well as auditability. In the case here, we can talk a little bit about the solution too. So with these ingredients, so the recurring tasks in the logs can all be done as SharePoint lists using Power Automate flows to generate the tasks and wait for changes to those recurring tasks. You can also have flows that as then so we have a recurring task list and then a task list. Recurring tasks is where I define my type of event. It's kind of like the in Outlook, if I'm defining my recurring meeting, I get a special dialog just for that. You can think of the recurring task list like that. And as these are generated, they're generated into the tasks. And then I can watch that and send reminder messages and create calendar entries based on that, and so on. And then I want to use Excel not as a data store, but it really is a logic engine. And we'll talk about sort of the reading and writing and how to manage that without collisions and all of those kinds of good things too. Now, for SharePoint lists, the first thing that we want to do for a good ALM is to plan to deploy them. And for this, the SharePoint PowerShell tools are fantastic. I mean, there's basically a way to take a set of lists and libraries that are in a site. You grab their GUIDs and you build a little script that goes and extracts all the configuration from them. And then I can take that, it basically amounts to a template that now I can go and apply to any other site in any other tenant. And it'll generate those lists and libraries for me, and this gives me some portability. But then the workflows on top of that are a separate piece, and this is where we want to have a plan to deploy the flows and make them portable as something called a Power Automate solution. Ideally, you would want to have local variables in each environment to basically first of all, just to define the environment, say this is dev, this is test, this is prod. But then in each of those environments, I might want to, I'll have different site endpoints. I'll have different credentials that are used to access the site, to create these items in the list, to run the workflows, and so on. And I really want to package these things and version them together so that I can, once I have my lists in place, I can then update my workflows on top of them, sort of as a group.
That's cool. I hadn't heard of the Power Automate solutions. I mean, that's why we've gone the Logic App path. We've invested a lot in ARM templates and DevOps pipelines for continuous deployment and stuff. So that's starting to come to Power Automate.
But there's a catch, which is great. So it's awesome.
But wait.
So this is the thing. So this is the idea, and we're going to talk through a little bit about the reality of it. Now, something about Power Automate, and we'll see this as we go forward, and but I want to briefly address this right now, since you've raised it, Peter, because it is, hey, this looks like the magic bullet that can finally give us what we need. The basic trick with it is that it does require premium licensing to be able to use the CDS connectors. So the Power Platform built on top of this common data service piece of Dynamics.
So it's tied into those environments.
Is a really sweet piece of work, and it turns out that's where all these services have been built. Power Apps, Power Automate to begin with, but then also Power BI and all and the analysis layers on top of this. But there are elements of then, so I can, and you'll see
there's common elements.
We can create the items, we can create environment variables, we can create connections, but we can't read all of those things from our flow.
And the other challenge I find is that there's kind of two environment models. There's the Dynamics model with these environments within one tenant, but so much of our work, we need separate Azure AD and like you need completely isolated dev, test, prod environments, and it doesn't lend itself to that.
Right. And so what I'm going to propose by the end of this is to say, hey, what if, so I've been using, oftentimes if a SharePoint site becomes kind of the app boundary, and I would have right back to on-prem, a config list with name value pairs, basically just two columns, using title plus a value column, or maybe several value columns depending on the type I needed to store. I would be able to put a configuration into a SharePoint list. And the other possibility that occurred to me with this when I ran into this kind of the CDS licensing issue was, well, why don't I just store the configuration right in those Excel files also, or in another Excel file, and have that be able to move around, but then I have one in each of my sites, and each one can be responsible for configuring a different environment. It almost becomes something like, that web config file back in IIS,
right.
or
app settings.json or something, yeah.
Or an app settings file, exactly. So that's the idea, and we'll get as far as we want to experiment with that kind of thing. But I will show you, here's where you can get with the solutions. Here's kind of the difficulty in then reading and writing, but then here's, once you see how the Excel reads and writes work, it might be very easy just to build a real standard little system that does exactly the same, but now moves things around. And it doesn't have to be an Excel file. It's whatever flows can read and write natively. If there's
easily, yeah,
a connector somewhere for JSON files to read and write, fantastic, and we can do this in text.
Can I bug you with one more question on this?
Go for it. Yeah.
I'm loving application insights in our .NET projects, and even now in our Logic Apps projects. The instrumentation, the dashboarding, you can build a whole ops dashboard of everything that's going on and how many requests are going through, how many successful, unsuccessful, and then drill right into the details. Yep. Can you light any of that up in Power Automate?
Fewer, and that's a little bit by design. So there are some pieces. I don't look them very often, but there is a link, and we'll take a look in there as we walk through.
Okay, thanks.
Remind me. And then the final piece. So the plan to deploy the library in the file. So it's simply, PowerShell would be a nice way to do this. There is a way, actually, and even with the provisioning of solutions, where you can also define a resource folder, and anything that's defined in that resources folder, it'll go and pull into the a target location also. in our case, we're just going to do some drag and drop around to get the files in place, and a wee bit of manual setup though, because once what's nice is honestly once you have the file defined, that sort of does where you build your functions in a sense. You could think of them like functions, even though it's still just a spreadsheet. You'll see what I mean. It's nice not to have to move them around. You want to update your flows, but the actual test cases and everything else, I kind of like those files to sit in one place and not to be overwritten with every new version that comes out, basically, or just to make that as part of it. But anyhow, we'll also see how this goes. So this is the basic idea. If I also like logical architecture diagrams, or in this case, kind of solution architecture diagrams, where it shows our standard layers the way that they ought to be. In this case, these are the services that we're aiming to use. It's going to be using, it can also say SharePoint sites or pages, because most of the time when we are building for SharePoint, it's going to be a web part. There could also be a box here that says SharePoint lists, or sorry, Microsoft lists, because they don't necessarily need to be members of SharePoint sites any longer, though the rollout model isn't necessarily beautiful for that either, in that they're stored with what used to be known as the My Site back in the on-premises days, and is something of a sibling of where your OneDrive for business files are stored in what amounts to a SharePoint site behind the scenes, of course. In any case, then we're going to use Power Automate. The Azure correspondent would be, of course, Logic Apps. We're going to, for this case, I want to use Power Automate mainly for, again, that the nice actionable messages. And Excel functions is where it is my own box that have been added here now. And on the data side, we're just going to use some CDS just to see what it'll do for us and what it won't. And then SharePoint lists and libraries, and we can talk a little bit more of that as we go. You can, even since it's really Power Automate that's doing the driving here, we don't have to be specific about saying we're using Outlook, we're using actionable messages. It really just becomes part of the connector for Power Automate, even though that's how it manifests. And the UI is even built right inside that, inside your flow. We're not using these things kind of as build environments. So let's see it. So I'm going to start with, let's start with the real one. Environment. So this is the recurring task list. Here are a bunch of recurring tasks. This, quickly, one of the things found, the idea, well, let's make one. Who has a, let's pick an event that may or may not be in here already. Anyone have a suggestion?
TSPUG talk?
TSPUG talks, perfect. Oh, you know what? This is one of the cases they don't have. We'll be able to do this in hours, but it's going to be a trick of theirs. We'll make this a one-time. So we're going to make this TSPUG December. I'll assign it to me. And you see what I did here was I built a Power App form in front of it and could add all these people in. This is monthly. We're just going to pick a fixed date because we'll see a different pattern that we can implement in the next one. That's going to be the one that gives us the third Wednesday of the month kind of thing. In our case, we're going to pick a one-time, we'll just call it monthly. And, oops, monthly choose. And so as I choose these different options, something that's really nice for users is to hide and show basically based on what I've chosen. If I'm choosing quarterly, I'm going to recur in certain months. If I'm monthly, I'm basically going to have all the other monthly options, but not the quarterly patterns there also. I could say we're going to force a weekday, but my monthly pattern is just going to be off of a day a month. And we'll just say it's going to be the 15th of every month for the sake of it. Or what's today? We've got the 16th. When I save that, it's going to update this list. Then what's going to happen is it's going to generate the actual task instance in here. If I keep this open long enough, it'll eventually come on up. But what I thought I would also do is kind of walk you through the solution. We might be able to see some of these things running, even in real time. So, see, it's been a while since I've even tested this. Always a good idea to taunt the demo gods, right?
No dry runs.
And basically, well, I'll run this. I'll look at this as an edit piece rather than 14 seconds ago. Let's take a look at the process first. Oh, first, solutions. So when you go from here, my list, I'll pick my recurring task list. Doesn't really matter where I start from. It's always going to be the same one, which is basically see my flows. When I go to see my flows, this continuously expanding menu of options now has something called solutions. It's been there for a little while, but not terribly long. And we have this thing called recurring tasks as a solution. We'll see a little bit more about creating them later on. And once I'm inside, I can see that I have a number of things, including environment variables. Would that they be as nicely accessible as we would like from the flows themselves. And we have some actual flows. I can sort this by type to help to keep everything sorted together a little better. But basic idea, generate tasks is the first one. Edit this. As items are created or modified, basically do some initialization of some private vars. I have a try catch block, maybe better written as or named as try finally. We'll talk a little bit about this pattern later on. What I'm doing is I'm opening up a spreadsheet. I'm seeing if a row exists. If it's an update, then I'm going to get rid of the old row and carry on. The catch is not going to do a whole lot. It's really just going to let me know if the row exists or not. Again, it could really be in this case, a finally block. We'll see that later on. Now that I've deleted any or cleaned up anything old there, I'm going to add my row to the table. It's just as simply going to, oh, come on, stop with all the helpiness. I'm just going to feed it an ID, a title. I'm going to take my run date, and this is a today function according to SharePoint. We'll talk a little bit about the SharePoint isms of date generation and Excel isms of converting dates. They each, of course, have completely different ways of doing these things. We're going to read if there was a last due date from a previous run that was stored in there before. It was one of the values that I might have grabbed from that Excel file before I killed the row. But now in my new row, I just basically plug all my parameters in, and we see that all of these things, which are going to be basically my calculation and output fields, you can think of them. I don't need to specify anything. I'm not going to write into them. That all gets written into the file now. Once I've written them, just like with an Excel file, they're right away available to read. So I simply use the same ID, and you'll see how we're keying this thing off of SharePoint list item IDs, just as a simple way to keep track of things and keep things relatively unique. We'll talk a little about concurrent events and collisions and such also. And once I get the calculated, basically what that gives me is the next occurrence of whatever this thing happens to be. Then I go and I look in the existing child tasks and make sure that I'm not hammering, if it's a duplicate, if it already existed, then I want to update. If it didn't already exist, then I want to create a brand new task. The end result of all this stuff should be that once I had recurring tasks, should have generated at the end TSPUG December, and once this event passes, it will come in there. Now, a couple of things of other features of this. You see that the next instance is going to be on the 1st of January. Sorry, is actually then. The reminder date would normally be 30 days earlier, which would have been today, or maybe it is legitimately tomorrow, being 30 days off. What I did as a fix-up in the function is basically if I create something that's fairly immediate future, if the reminder date would have been in the past or today, since this thing runs at sometime early morning in the wee hours, basically if it was going to be yesterday, if you weren't going to get a reminder message, this forces a reminder message for the next run of it, which is going to be basically tomorrow morning. So that's why the reminder date is in this case possibly set to the 17th, or maybe the 17th is just the naturally 30 days before the 16th. In any case, I have this set up to test only. What would happen if we actually saw this? I would get on that reminder date something like this that would basically say, hey, something was assigned to you and requires your attention. If you have any questions, reach out. Something missing here. Oh, this is actually the one. So this is the calendar item, of course, that gets created. This case, it's one that's running on it would be on December 28th. You'll see that the January 16th, I can also bring up my calendar and show you how that also created an invitation for me. So now it shows up in the calendar. But this is the nice piece. So that the reminder message, this is the one that would come out on the 17th saying, hey, you have something to do on the a TSPUG meeting for the 16th of January. I can then call this an actual message. I can click on this. Whoops. And here we go. I click mark completed, and the action comes back as complete and says is successfully registered. What's really nice about this, again, the user never has to leave the environment of Outlook. They're something like 80% more likely to actually click it and use it when this is the case. When you use these types of messages in approval workflows, it increases by the early examples, at least from Microsoft, were like a factor of 5. If something took 4 to 5 weeks to happen before, it would typically happen within a week with an actionable message. And the result, and it's all simply because you're not making a person go to some other place, stop reading their inbox, and it can happen right away without a login, without not knowing what happens when I click a button that takes me somewhere else. And then the message updates so that if I come and look at this after vacation and say, geez, did I get that finished before? The message has changed. I don't have the ability to click mark completed anymore. And the message actually reads, as you see it here, you've done this already. Go do something else. Work on the rest of the inbox. So how do we build this thing? And we saw kind of how this came together. So we saw a number of flows. When I first started to build this and in a solution, it did start out as a fairly monolithic kind of thing where, generate tasks, where's it gone now? Branched into 4 or 5 different paths, depending on, what type of recurring event are you creating? Is it monthly? Is it a one-time? Is it quarterly? Is it annual? And then for each of those things, it would have a different path. And it was just, this is absolutely ridiculous. And what Excel kind of gives us is this ability to do this. You can think of it as a massively parallel system only, or let's call it a somewhat parallel system, where I'm going to write once and just use the answers that I actually need. We'll take a look real quick at how that looks. I'll show you what the behind the scenes, then the actual file for this looks like. I'm going to go into site contents. I've created this recurring task app files do not edit, just to give users kind of the nothing to see here kind of message. I've given the spreadsheet a fairly devy kind of name. And you see, first of all the instances of things that I created as tests. So this is kind of the scratch pad as I was working out how this stuff would work. We're going to see this stuff again. And for each of the scenarios, whether it's the month through was day of month or month end, whether there's a specific due date or not, which, happens for one-time events. It also happens for anniversaries. You'd also have you'd set a sort of an initial date. If I want to say every leap year, I would start have a starting point and then be able to do offsets in years in this case. I have this require weekday modifier, which can behave different ways depending on whether I'm keyed off the start or the end of a month. If I'm keyed off the start of a month and I require a weekday, I'm going to move it forward to the next Monday. If I'm trying to calculate the last weekday of the month, I'm going to obviously start with the last day of the month and move backwards to the previous Monday. So even some of these things are going to have different behavior as I go. But these are basically all the parameters that the user enters in that little UI that built. Then calculates, here's the specific type of pattern you're talking about. Here's how we calculate for quarterly. Here's something where I'm just going to basically move the date over for a one-time due date. Here's more for quarterly calculations. Here's some stuff that's going to throw errors because it's intended only for annual cases where I don't necessarily have numbers populated. And all those are perfectly fine as long as, and then I calculate, okay, for all these things, here's the date that they're actually going to fall on, the day of week. And where else? So this is if I have to roll the date backwards. Here's if I have to roll the date forwards from one of these, from a weekend. And then based on what they've selected, I'm going to switch depending on whether it's, for the reminder, is the reminder start of month, or is it going to be 30 days or none? And I'm going to figure out when the reminder might be. And then, again, dependent on what they've chosen, I'm going to do some if-thens. There's probably some switch cases somewhere here earlier. There we go, switch pattern. So based on the pattern, one time it's going to take the one-time due date. If it's a monthly keyed off of the day of month, it's going to use this as its value. If it's monthly keyed off of the month end, it's going to use this as its value, quarterly day of month, and so on, annually and so on. So ultimately it's going to take that, then it's going to figure out, does it need to roll it back some focusing a weekday, and then ultimately comes up with a final due date and the final reminder date. That's the complete logic behind how this whole thing works. This was my scratch pad to make sure the dates actually calculated correctly, and then I just gave them IDs that would never recur. And a similar kind of thing for now the actual cases. You can see our TSPUG December appears down here. And the next time this thing runs, the first thing it's going to do is look to say, hey, have I been run before? Yes or no. If I have, then let's update. And if not, then I'm just going to create a new row. Questions so far? All right.
Eli, can I ask a question?
Dennis.
I had a problem, it was about a year ago, where I tried to play around with Excel and try to use it as a data source that I needed to write often to. And I found there was a problem where if somebody has an Excel file open, Power Automate just fails to write a row. From what I saw, it doesn't seem you write to Excel a lot, but does your solution have the same problem where
no, and this
is,
I'll show you a couple of tricks around those collisions. So the first thing that is very nice, and maybe it didn't work this way when you did, is multi-author works just fine. So I can have my, and I don't have it open here, but basically I can have this Excel file open. I can be updating my functions as I'm going and testing, test it out through the interface. I can see the new entries being created in here as they're being generated, but it shows the multi-author experience so that we can both have this file open at a time. I can have as many people as that multi-author supports having this file open at a time. The other thing that needs to be done is I'm choosing my IDs so I'm not clobbering myself. We'll come to this soon also, but bears repeating. I'm using so this app, I know it's going to be used and managed by one person. She'll manage this recurring task list and would be the only one on there at a time. So I don't have those kinds of collisions. What I could also do, though, is concatenate a SharePoint list item ID with a the current user's email address, their account name, and use that to generate a unique key. Because what's important here is that it's a unique key, not necessarily that it's and one that responds to a VLOOKUP, I think, so that I can keep writing a row that's going to avoid a collision. The other trick that we're doing within this is it is defined as a table, and you can see by this being blue, even though I've set these to be, I just like highlighting them as calculation fields just to keep it obvious which are parameters and which aren't for me. It is a table, and so it will let the system automatically add and remove those rows to this Excel table, not just an Excel worksheet. Make sense? And so I don't think, or if you design it carefully, you should be able to get both the multi-user and avoiding the collisions, because each operation should be happening on a unique row at any given time. I'm not reusing rows. I'm not trying to reuse a data store. The problem with a flat Excel file, which you'll see is it's this nature of having a table that lets me create functions that then automatically replicate to all the other rows in that column so that they're all identical and are always kept identical. And it does have that offset of, you can see it's sort of the Q1, Q2, but on some of these other ones, it's actually using what's more like a variable name here, which becomes a very handy and intuitive for any of us developers way to define these things. Hopefully that helps.
Sorry, I don't want to kind of hold you and
No
take
problem.
more time, but one more question. Did you have a problem where when you ask Power Automate to add a row, it generates that ugly unique ID in your Excel file, or you somehow
No, I'll
avoided
show
this
you. And
problem?
again, we can do the walkthrough. So for generating those IDs, in my case, I'm using, when I create the items, I'm using it's creating a unique identifier. That's the trick. SharePoint list item IDs work great. Yeah,
Okay.
in the case of something that corresponds to a SharePoint list.
Thanks.
Okay. So when thinking about this, as you said, I had this big monolithic flow with all this branching based on the type, and it was ugly, and the logic was about to get really complicated. And so I thought it worth mentioning that when you are building any kind of a solution on top of this stuff, think of each method having one activity. So in my case, it's, or especially with SharePoint driven, it's as simple as for each list and type of event that I'm handling, I'm going to make that a distinct flow. And even in those cases, I might break some of those down, especially if I reuse them, into subflows. And there's a lot written online now about calling a child flow, so you can have these parent-child relationships, and you can treat these child flows almost like their own little function libraries that go off and do their own special set of operations, whether send an email, ask for approval, update a value somewhere. Basically, try to break these into each one of these things should do one thing, which is a basic rule of what we call refactoring as it applies to code, especially in any case. Each activity should be implemented once. If it's needed more than once, move it to its own child method, that I can call from different places. Do your best not to hard code values. That includes, where possible, names of sites, connection strings. You'll see you can change those inside of a flow. So these things can become kind of parameters that I configure for an environment rather than hard coding and having to update some kind of a value for each environment. And then there are exceptions, and if it's a simple enough app that building it as a monolith isn't going to create any kind of problems for maintaining it, because it's fairly small. I don't want to complicate this any more than I absolutely have to. Sure, there are simple cases, single flow, like an approval. There's no reason to break that into, 3 or 4 discrete tasks. One that, Matt updates a task list, another one that is responsible for sending emails. I don't really need to break it up if it's much more maintainable as a single thing. But generally, you want to break things out so that each flow does one thing. Here's an example of sort of how it looked. The 4 scenarios: one time, monthly, quarterly, or annually. Calculate, calculate, calculate. Do some adjustment at the end. Add a calendar, send a reminder. Each of these different pieces was looking like it would be absolutely insane to build, even if I was going to go to Excel, when it made sense to simplify to this. So each has one job. For each item in recurring tasks, create an Excel row with parameters, read the results, and then go and create or update the task. That's the nutshell of all that it really does. Then in the actual task list, when on create or update, create a calendar entry. Really just that simple. In the end, on update, it's not going to create a second one, but it will tell the user that, hey, something changed about this. You might need to update something. We'll also see how that, different things to think through. And then the send reminders. Basically, you have a daily trigger that walks through the task list again, and if the reminder date equals today, send an email. But in this case, again, we pushed that logic down into Excel, so now my flow isn't massively complicated. It's long enough as it is, as you'll get to see. But it really gives something that, now, can a user work with this? It's pretty daunting when you first see this, but it's not impossible to learn, let's put it that way. So if you have somebody who would be capable of editing one of these things and sort of getting comfortable with it, it is possible to show them how to use it. And people know how Excel works. So if it's a simpler calculation, it's really not that hard. And if all I really need to show them is my set of examples, and then they can sort of go through and plug away at it and work out their own, pretty soon they'll be coming up with their own ideas in any case. So, all right. Now, which kind of moves us into a couple other things I wanted to talk about before we leave solutions completely here. Well, no, let's build this one with the new one, and then we can actually do both things at once. So the rest of this, we'll mix up the ideas a wee bit. We're going to start going deeper on what this Excel thing looks like and how we kind of build that up. And here's the app that we're going to build, or at least do a walkthrough of a much simpler case. One of the reasons that I really want to distribute the solution is so that the switch back to the final flows here. It's really this: create that Excel row with parameters, read the row together with the results, and then go and do something. So thinking along those lines, wanted to take sort of this existing thing and transform it into something that's a little easier to think about. And I'm just going to call it a central schedule for days off. I'm going to put public holidays in there and vacation days. The types of tasks that we're going to support are going to be like the TSPUG meetings, like annual events on an anniversary. So every January 1st is New Year's Day. Every December 25th is Christmas. Might have one-time events also, like a office boot camp. Then we have different holidays that are annually on the nth day of the month. So the second Monday in October might be a TSPUG meeting. We don't have here is actually that monthly piece. We could add that in. Maybe we could treat that as our test case. So we do have annual on the nth day of the month. So the second Monday after October is Thanksgiving in Canada, for example. And then there are always these complicated cases that you might have to build a fairly complex function for, like Easter or like Hanukkah. Easter can be defined for most years with a fairly brief Excel calculation. But this is the logic behind it. And then Hanukkah falls on the 25th day of the month of Kislev in a Jewish calendar, which runs on some kind of solar rather than lunar, how does it go again, calculation of leap years. And leap years are thrown in, as far as I can tell, somewhat at random. And it's basically to the point that nobody has online attempted any kind of an automatic algorithm that I've been able to find on calculating Hanukkah. So I thought, hey, this is a great way to show how we might want to use a table for a lookup of values. In this case, I'm just going to look up, based on the year that to generate for, we're going to look up the value of the actual date. So that's the plan. Now, what are we going to build here? We're going to have much of the same setup. I don't think I got as far as the logging list. In fact, I know I didn't. But generally, we're going to run much the same. Instead of recurring tasks, it's called recurring events now. We define them in one list. We're going to generate a list of events. We're going to end up with a calendar entry. We're going to use a spreadsheet to do it. So what does this look like? All right, first thing, let's find the right tenant. Here's my app files. And this is to give you an idea of kind of how I started with both of these. This idea was, as Dennis was suggesting, really just taking a spreadsheet. I'm going to fill in my own values here, and maybe it's going to be Boxing Day. And Boxing Day, we'll make that a stat holiday, and the pattern is going to be I'm calling month day here when it's always on December 24th, December 21st, December 31st. 26th December 2020. Require a weekday. No, it doesn't always fall on a weekday for the purposes of releasing, when you get to take the holiday. Or maybe I want to push it next Monday, sure. Values I can work on, and then I calculate. So you see what I did for Easter as an example. Here's the formula that you can find with a Google search. Simply takes the year and generates a date from it. Then what I'm doing is generating one for this year and another for next year. You see I'm using H6, which is that. I could also do +1 rather than different cell. And then to calculate Easter, so I'm just going to say, hey, if I'm already past the date for now, then book the next occurrence of it. Basically, if I'm past the last one, then generate the next one. And you see that in it does it a little differently in the other one, where there are other ways to calculate this. It takes a lot longer to think about, and so I haven't done it that way for the quick version. But I did spend the time thinking through, and basically there are calculations you can use that basically say, based from today's date, calculate me the next one, and it's based on the number of periods elapsed since the last one, and so on. But there is a way to do it. Then what I end up with is an Excel date. So really it starts with all this stuff until I get the right dates figured out, and then the next calculated instance, we might think of this as, I'm just going to use one of the switch statements that basically, depending on the type of pattern, I'm going to choose equals. Question is going to be based on this pattern. If it's equal to Easter, then use this date. And that's the symbols it needs to be, and I just need to make sure that the right dates appear in the column as I keep on going for each of these items. So that's my starting point. The next thing that I want to do as these start coming into place is under insert, we get this link for table, and it will guess where my data is. When I click OK, now it's converted it to a table. Now the nice thing is that when I create one of these guys, I'm just going to save this. It already is. Reopen it in the client. And then worksheet 2, of course, is going to be our fully baked. Of course, it's going to be assigned somewhere along the way. Oh, which tenant am I in? Oh, credentials cached. Okay. Once I get my good values, what will happen is these eventually automatically start filling in for you. If I try to get this to, there we go. Sometimes to reset these columns, what you do is you delete the values, copy the value basically, and then delete the existing ones. Paste it in, and now it propagates to all the other rows. But basically, as new rows get added, the idea is that this is going to always pull my functions into the new values or pull these calculations into the new rows automatically so that I don't have to think about it. This year, probably going to be keyed off of either to date or maybe the date that the item was created, for an example. But basically everything that you can make calculated, you want to grab all these, delete them all, and see the magic. And then wherever something actually makes sense, 10. Pasted text rather than rows there. We can correct all this stuff just by. And eventually we get the right calculations, and it's like, okay, my spreadsheet is coming together and I can start dealing with other scenarios. Now, the baked version of this, I'll show you where it all kind of headed, but that's basically the steps. You start out, you figure out what parameters it takes to actually get the values you're looking for. And once things seem to start to hang together, we get what looks more like this. Tell it who I am again. Already has cached credentials. You can see that, oh, there's another one that got created, uncreated, and updated again. Again, here are all the ones that I built out as, it starts with ID in a title column. And then the other pieces, I'm just going to create additional columns in my source list for defining those, and then I can use Power Apps to make a nice interface in front of that. User never has to look at the kind of the complexity of this. The idea is that I really just want to hide and show them things based on what they're actually doing or the actual pattern that they've selected. Once I have those, and then in this case also, my run dates, I'm storing run dates in my test cases I just used today, but I can set those to whatever I like, and I can test for dates in the future, for example. As tempting as it is to key everything off of, today in the actual calculations, you eventually figure out that, oh, I'm going to need to test for other cases beyond this. And so I want to set those, but then as I'm writing my actual values, I'm going to write the actual date that this happened, or convert the created or last modified date from SharePoint and write it into the field, and then everything else becomes a calculation. Also see that sort of that this year or next year idea for each of these things where I'm just using, oops, let's not change anything significant. The idea of taking two different years. In this case, let's fix this up by making it correspond to the run date instead. Here's a good example of it. The way that I can define these now that it's a table also is nice and simple like so. Automatically updates everything else. Slick, hey? And then the fewer places that I'm actually using this today model. And updates everything else for me. So this year, next year, and if it's already past the current one, then go with the next year value. That's all it's doing. It's the same thing for now doing Easter. I need to know what year it is. So I calculate this and next and then finally get my final. For the Hanukkah calculation. So there isn't a great calculation, but as promised, there is a pretty good website, or a website. It doesn't really matter as long as they have something displayed somewhere in table form. And it turns out Excel is really good at reading those kind of public tables. So this is handy for not just something like this, but currency conversions. So here's what we have here. Got this little piece that pulls each of these dates in and does a currency and does a and it's really just defining a table source with this one. Table transform. It basically gives it a place where the thing, oh, this is also for my ETL kinds of things. If I want to do any transformations on the way in, I'll just pick a new one. So if this is my source, I can just say data, get data, whoops, not from text or CSV file, but from the web. So data, get data from the web. Here's the URL. It goes and looks at the page and says, hey, we found some data here. Do you mean this? Do you mean this? Do you mean this? Do you mean this? And we can pull this one in. We can give it a sensible name, and it actually drops it into the sheet exactly the way that it has right here. So now we have a table where my leftmost column can be used with a VLOOKUP that will give me my actual date. The other odd thing that this does is, you see back on the web page, I need to do a little bit of fix up because it's only giving us day and month. And so I'm going to have to supply the year myself. So there's a wee bit of conversion yet to be done, and I left the text fields in also. So for the calculation, it's exactly a VLOOKUP into my Hanukkah table, and it's going to calculate both this year and next year, do the lookups for each of those. These ones, it can keep the screwy, everything is 2020, which is just the way that it reads those dates. It automatically assigns it this. But then if we're already past this date, which is already going to be this year, so all good there, then for next year, calculate year plus one and basically provide a new date where I'm going to combine the specific year, the year I'm calculating for, and then the month out of my calculation, the day out of the calculation, because those are the reliable pieces. Well, that makes sense still. Then somewhere in the last thing, I figure out my little switch case based on the pattern, anniversary, an Easter style thing, an nth date of month, or whether it's specifically Hanukkah. I now just have a switch case to decide that. If I have a require weekday, because even if Christmas falls on a Sunday, we get the Monday off. And so it'll do that in the final calculation where it starts to use this require weekday function. And what's super handy, there are actually about more than a dozen overloads for this weekday function, this next calc day. It basically gives me a integer back depending on the different style of date I want. I'm using return type 3 here, but let's see all the choices. Numbers 1 through 7 starting with Monday, 1 through 7 starting with Sunday, Monday, a zero-based array of weekdays, and so on. Basically starting on any pretty much any day of the week. And that turns out to be super useful for doing calculations where I always want to isolate Saturday, Sunday at the high end of the list or the low end of the list, for example, which is kind of what I want to do here. So that we see with style number 3. Style number 3 is zero-based Monday through Sunday being 6. And then based on that, if I get a number that's greater than 4, I know that I'm falling on a weekend, and I need to calculate the add enough days to make it to the next Monday. And this is a simple way to calculate the next Monday. So anyway, and so there we go. So any cases where I actually have that flag picked, require weekday. If those fell on a Monday, you can actually just see it by comparing these two. If it falls on a Sunday here, it's going to get pushed over to the Monday as the final date, as an example. So that's how I composed the whole thing. Now to the reading and writing.
Just one question while you were talking Mondays. if you had like Christmas on the Saturday and Boxing Day on the Sunday, does that give you Monday and Tuesday, or is it still going to go to the Monday for both of them?
It's whatever logic you want to put in. I mean, that's kind of the nice thing about this is I can say it's not doing them as a pair, but it'll push to the next whatever, if that makes sense. If I needed to do the logic, so let's break down what you're thinking about. First of all, it's a date range with a start and an end, and if the start and the end both fall on Saturday, Sunday, maybe I give you the Monday, Tuesday off instead, right? That's kind of what you want to aim for.
Right.
And the day before, we're just going to say is an early release day, but then, because that's going to be Friday, and but with my Saturday and Sunday. So what I would have to do is set, here's the date range for that vacation, and now I might just call it Christmas break. And I'll say, calculate my Christmas break on the 25th and lasting for 2 days. And if that happens to fall on, if my first day happens to fall on a Saturday, I'm going to push that by 2. But because my duration always stays at 2 days, when it pushes that start date over to Monday, then the rest is going to follow. So my logic would change. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess you're always assuming that Christmas is going to be 2 days. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But you're planning a different kind of thing because you're doing a 2-day holiday that's going to start on a weekday, right?
Yeah.
And I have a start and an end, and now I'm going to define, rather than a start and an end, I might define the start date plus the length of it. That's the difference. It's just a different way of thinking about how I'm going to write.
I guess I'm just thinking, are there those holidays that fall on, when the moon is here and this and that, and then suddenly that falls on a Saturday, but the same, weekend, there's also another holiday, but I don't think doesn't happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not a real act. Again, you figure out the logic that you want to have it. And the nice thing about this, the method here is it's not too hard to figure out those calculations. Like it's pretty easy for me to figure out what my input parameter is going to be. Maybe I want to define a start and an end date, but I'm still going to realize later on that I've got to calculate how many days long that is. You know what I mean? So it in the end, it's think in terms of how I want this to appear to users who have to follow along with it, or who are going to get the calendar entries, and it should make good sense from then. But I will show you. It does lead into a question of how do I then create a calendar entry of this, and we'll take a look at that in a later step. Because it turns out that for an all-day event, you still need a start and an end time, otherwise Outlook barfs. Oh, Any other questions about the spreadsheet itself and kind of how it works? So the magic is the ID column and the fact that we've converted our rough worksheet into a table, so that now we have a way of, once we define a function, it automatically gets replicated into all the other instances of that. And then once I've also done that, it's nice to convert any of your today references to base off of a run date. It helps you both during testing and once things go live. Now, what other wrinkles can we find? So here's this one. Okay, so we're back to our worksheet. So in this case, when I create a new item now, and Boxing Day was the one we were going to make, I'm going to keep this spreadsheet open just so that we can test out the case that Dennis was curious about in, can I have this open and the account is actually going to do the work for me still. So make a new item. It looks like, oh, I'm in the wrong list. Recurring events, creates events. So same pattern here. We have a recurring events list, and then it's going to generate the actual event. And then when the actual event is generated, that's when I'm going to create, calendar entry, whatever else I want to do with it. We'll make this one Boxing Day. It's going to be set holiday. It's going to be on an anniversary. It's always going to be on the 26th. And what's curious, and maybe somebody else knows the answer to this particular one, is that when I created this, I did build a Power App form, but it never seemed to apply to the list. In some cases, it's like, it seems like you wait long enough and something finally kicks in, but don't know if it was just something that I missed along the way. If anybody recognizes the obvious mistake, that would be great to know. I'm going to save this, and we're going to say required weekday.
If you build the form and it doesn't show up, we can go to the list settings and then form settings and then select the Power App if it's not selected.
That could be just that simple. In any case, I did something similar here, and this is just a brief sidebar. The handiest thing that I've ever found in is hide show. So basically setting the visible property based on another property. So if I have a pattern of an anniversary, I want to see the anniversary date. If I have the pattern of nth date of month, I'm going to say the first Friday in April or one. And also holding down Alt lets me test my form immediately so I can see, there's some cases here that don't need any extra properties. But it's just about as simple as, for example, if the anniversary date card has under advanced, nice little if statement around the visibility. So first thing to note is make sure that each one of these values gets a real, preferably gets a real, title value, for example, or pattern value name. So then my anniversary date can be keyed off of the visibility. Where did I leave that? Oh, entire card, sorry. So the entire card can say if pattern value dot selected dot value equals anniversary, visible is true, otherwise visible is false. Super, super handy, and users appreciate this little touch immensely in every case. And Dennis, I absolutely will check to see if it's just the setting of the darn piece. Anyway, once this is all good, and I go back to SharePoint, since I have published changes, I don't probably have that much. The settings. And where are we? Label advanced. Oh, form settings. Magic. That's been done. Let's see if that was the only thing that was missed here. Still not quite. I guess I can republish it back to the list, and then it would finally go. I'm not going to burn the time with that. You get the idea. So this works here from recurring events. The event should be generated. Let's go see what's happened with this. So here I am back in a solution. I have when an event is created, it's going to do something. Let's see if it's hit my spreadsheet yet. I don't see this. Boxing Day, there you go. And typically haven't had a collision, or I've always been able to keep this open and actually see this appear when the item gets created or when the item gets updated. We can even sort of, well, we'll see what happens if we make a change. But on create, this happened a couple of minutes ago. Oh, and it would have created a calendar entry. So that's somewhere in Megan's calendar. See that also. So we have two things happening. First of all, so we have on recurring events on change. So this is new or updated. We'll walk through it one by one. And then there's a second one that as things are created in the events list, it's going to start generating calendar entries for that also. Nice little combination of things. So this is in the solution. Show you the pattern for working with this file. It's going to start out with created or modified. That's going to be typically the case if you're following a similar pattern, but you can have something that calls the Excel, this, think of it as like calling the Excel service. It's going to write some values. So I'm going to listen for those, and I'm going to write my row. I'm going to initialize a variable that I might use later on if I want to figure out when I last calculated this. Then I'm going to do this try-catch pattern. So these are scope activities. The way that I create them, and this one might best be named a finally because we'll see. So I'll show you how they get done first. I'll make a new one up here. Add an action. Scope. It's as simple as renaming this try. The magic happens. Whoops. Duplicate. Try this. Let's do it. Try. There we go. I'm going to do something else. So it's really just to rename it, and the name is just a name. The magic happens in what I do immediately after that. So again, with a scope, I could call this catch. Again. And this little configure run after. So inside my try, I'm going to have an event that may or may not fail. And basically here I would say if it's failed. And then I can have some actions in here that work. Then in that case, then I can add a final one. That's going to be my finally, which in this case is configure run after. And this time, no matter what the previous thing, so either this got run and it skipped because things were successful. So if this fails, catch is going to execute. If either of these execute, so whether this executes or not, my finally is always going to run. And that's basically the pattern that should always be to define a try-catch finally. And that's where this one, I think earlier I said this one might also be called simply finally, because no matter what, it's going to continue the flow. And now I can delete these guys, so you get the idea. In my case here, I'm not, in other words, catching anything, and so I'm not going to label it catch because that would be not entirely accurate. It's simply a try finally block with what would amounts to an empty catch, because finally is going to run, as we see once again, no matter what the previous operation does. And what's it going to try? The try is going to get the existing row. So when my item is created or modified, I don't have anything special there. It's going to go and look up from the key column ID based on the value of my original SharePoint item. Just that simple. So if the ID of if it's the very first item in the list, it's going to have an ID of 1. It's the 50th item, it's going to have an ID of 50. This always, at least in my case, because I only have one user, it's always going to guarantee me a unique row. If it's likely that 2 people are going to be working on the same one, then maybe my key column should instead be ID plus username, and I'm going to concatenate those 2 as I'm building up my spreadsheet, so that rather than just being 7, it would be 7 Eli at needmoresolutions.com as an example. And then it can use this as a key so that for each person who might be doing the editing, it's going to get its own dedicated row where it can run its calculation that's not going to conflict with any other users at that time. And if I'm connected to my tenant, which I would be with my usual account, because I'm in here, and this is actually stored in a demo tenant, because the identities are different, that's likely why it asked me to reopen the file because another user had made changes. It's really monitoring this file for changes from, or it's monitoring Excel for changes from my own tenant. I haven't necessarily authenticated with Excel to be able to have it specifically, registered to or locked into that user's account. I believe that's the thing. If it's working within the same tenant, I should be okay. Since my Excel is really linked to my work account, if I was working on using that one, I wouldn't have had to reopen the file. It would just show me in place who else is working on this. That might be a service account. It might be my demo account inside here that actually created these things, who was good old Megan Bowen from Contoso. Anyway, so I'm going to try to get an existing row, see if it exists. If it does, and the count is greater than 0, basically I have a little condition. A little bit of calculations there. So if the output from that get existing row is more than 0, then I'm going to know that I have a last calculation date. And once I kind of get the date out of there for that says, here's the last time you ran this, then I can safely delete that row, and now I have a blank working space. So why did I go through all this trouble? So nice to have these values from past runs so I can debug. If I'm only creating and destroying these things every time they get used, it'll work, but I'll never have them there to see what happened or see what might have gone wrong in the case that somebody says, hey, it spit out the wrong value. There will be times when you're doing the date math coming back to a SharePoint date or from SharePoint into Excel, where the calculation from Excel didn't land perfectly, and the date's off by 1, or vice versa, where SharePoint, I read a date value, it gave me back a date adjusted for UTC, because this is what SharePoint stores actually in the database before it's been modified by the time zone the site is set to. And now my dates might get off by one way or another. And we'll look at a couple other ways to kind of work around that. But it's the kind of thing that you're going to have to spend a little bit of time studying and looking out for, especially for doing date math between SharePoint and Excel. So there's my value. I delete the row if it was already there. And then finally, I'm just going to add the row with all my parameters, very much like the last one that we saw. It's going to take all my possible parameters that I collected from the form. It's going to take my run date. You see, again, we have this slightly convoluted way for flows and SharePoint to do this. It's always going to be today starts with UTC now. Then I have to convert from UTC into Eastern Time, and then I have to give it a date format. So most date-related functions are nice enough that they give you as their final parameter an output date. And once you get used to sort of what the patterns are, it becomes easy to generate these non-ambiguous date formats that are accepted by both SharePoint and Excel. This is when they happen to like, so it gives me the the days, then the month is OCT, NOV, DEC, for example, rather than just a number, so it's not ambiguous as it's adding it to that Excel file. Excel knows exactly how to interpret it. And if I had a last calculated date from the previous run, then I can sort of always store the value from the last run, so I can see a pattern over time. Then I read my results back simply by getting the values again at my ID. I initialize my event date, which is going to again, this is actually pretty simple. It's really just a couple of init. It's now going to get the items from the place it's generating the tasks into. So now we're looking at the event list. And it's going to run a query here. So let's think about what we want to do here too. This particular case, events. So next Christmas, I want my Christmas Eve to be on 12/24/2021. Do I want to overwrite this? No. It's legitimately the previous instance of this event. The next time I want to generate it, it'll have the same parent ID, it'll have the same title, but it'll have a new date of 12/24/2021. And so it's going to be in addition to. So it's not truly a duplicate when the next year's instance comes up. But if I tried to generate it right now, or I was running this every day to generate the next one, it would keep seeing, oh, you already exist, then I don't need to write you. And especially if I knew that it was last modified by the service account, I would know that it hasn't been touched by a user anywhere along the way, for example. So I might be able to add information about what made the change rather than just when. Just an idea. So where are we again? So now when I get the items to check for duplicates, it'll have to be something that lands on the same date and has the same ID. So if I generated the same December 24, 2020 again, it should get that in this query. And these filter queries are real handy in that I can have multiple conditions on them. But we see the first case of how Excel is real convoluted about generating dates. This string, format date time, we add seconds from, or basically add an amount of time, number of days, from December 30, 1899. And then there's some modifiers in there because Excel is wonky. I'll just say don't take the first answer you see for how to convert Excel into SharePoint dates on the web. Do some testing because they don't all work in the same way as reliably as you would like. This function seems to be reliable, and so I've used it and I've put it into the deck so you'll be able to find it. Once I have my items back, I can check again if the length of this set is more than 0. It's basically checking for the length of the body of the results. That items body result in a length of more than 1. If it did, it's just a slightly different check to see if, for checking for multiple items. Then for each one of these things, I'm going to update the item. Otherwise, which is really just going to be one item, because the way I've designed this, it's never going to have more than one instance of that. And if it doesn't already exist, it's simply going to create it. Here again, how it's, in one case, updating the item back in SharePoint with that add seconds from Excel. In this case, it's creating the item in SharePoint now with that add seconds from Excel, and everything else is pretty much normal. This being the last item here, kind of useless. You could probably delete that safely. It looks like it's a superfluous extra limb, and everything else seems to run fairly reliably.
Sorry, Eli, just
ahead,
a heads up. I think we were intended to only go to 8. We're a little past that now.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, we can wrap up pretty much from here anyway.
I do want to give you some time though to kind of summarize. It's a cool topic.
Yeah, we'll be good in about 10 or 15 minutes for sure. And so that's honestly the build. From here, the other things that are helpful to know. So once, I'm gonna not make any permanent changes just in case I've fat fingered anything. So my recurring events piece, we had, because it's all part of a solution, these things will hang together. If I want to create a new connection, I can create it through here. What happens then inside my workflow? I'll just pick on, this is, once a new event gets created, I'll edit this one. And you can see that it's, even at the top here, letting me select a connection reference. So if I've defined two, one is the default thing that got created originally when I created the SharePoint thing. The other one is something specifically called App Web, which is the one that I want to travel with my solution. And so the App Web reference is the one I want to consistently use. If I wanted to use a service account, that's where that value would go. I would create a different connection reference. I would add it to the solution, not just to the instance here. But I would put it back in my, this is kind of always a two-step to get from my flow back into the solution piece. I got to go to solutions, then I got to go to recurring events. It's nice just to keep this open. But this app web now is reusable, and it's going to be a thing. I also have this SharePoint reference. It's going to be a reusable connection reference. But as we can see, these are just connection references. Same thing goes for the Outlook. Which account am I using for this? So what you really want to do is use a service account for these things. And why? Because Megan's role is going to change. She's going to move on into, a different place in the organization. She might get the offer, job offer of a lifetime next week, and we don't want to have her account, credentials required to modify, to update all this, what we've built here. So this is why service accounts, even with flows, and especially this is one of the reasons why we had to turn to Logic Apps before, but now because I can have custom connections with my flows, as I move this this particular flow from environment to environment, the connections will be recreated as I'm installing that solution into the new environment. The first thing it does before it imports, as I try to import the solution, is it'll say, hey, there are several connection references in here. 1, 2, 3, 4 of them, and it'll have me wire each of those up to an account, and in the case of Outlook, to a calendar, for example. So part of our portability. We can also have these environment variables, but the trick is that in the actual flow, and we'll just check this one again, the very first thing I would need to do as I edit this is to initialize my new variable, and the trick I would, and then once I have my variable, I would go to CDS, and, where am I? Actually, I think it's a little easier to find that. Even all that now, isn't it? I'm a data service. I would go and read a value basically from get a record, but it's a premium service, so this is a bummer. But it's where what I was thinking is, since we're able to read and write these Excel files for all these values, why not do it for my configuration properties also? And then the file can just sit in my app files library, untouched, configured for that environment. I can update my workflows. I can deploy new solutions on top of that site or that tenant, new versions of my solution, and I just have to do my wire up again, unless I've stored everything in an Excel file, and all I have to do is wire up that Excel file. And in one step, I've got all my configuration values. Whole lot simpler than having to wire up, which list are you pointed to, which case. And basically what you do is you would store the GUIDs for these things, so that for an item like this, where I look in and I see my parameters, the data set, the table, these refer to that SharePoint instance, and I basically just capture. I can either do it if I want to store as JSON and then parse my JSON, or I can just take the individual values for data set for table, and these are the things that I can actually use. For example, here, done, is a custom value, and this will work just the same as specifying the actual name of the thing. So that's the basic idea behind how you would save and retrieve values for this. And so rather than a list name, I would actually use a variable name in here that would refer to the GUID that I read out of my Excel file as an example. Or the if I had the premium license or an E5, it's something that let me use that CDS environment variables and read them. I would be storing and retrieving GUIDs into that and references like this. So peak code is your friend for figuring out what the actual references are for the sites and the lists and so on. So when all that stuff happens, I'll leave this again without saving changes. Oops, of course, we're in somewhere else completely. We're back in my solution. And all that we do,
Eli, are you calling any flows from within flow?
No, I don't chain them as often. In my case, I didn't have any cases where I needed to call child flows. I just simply set up new events around the new list where I want to watch. So in my case, it produces an event. Once the event gets created, I can run another one. So it does chain them, but SharePoint's responsible for the chaining. I'm not automatically chaining, if that makes sense.
Okay, and do you know if you do that, if you call a flow from within a flow, it's a premium license, or
no, there is it seems to be, and this is something else where I've been able to, I haven't had to rely on that particular one, but it seems to be real common nowadays, and anybody else can vote for it, to call a child flow without that premium required.
Okay.
I don't believe so. And even within the premium, like if your parent flow is a premium and you call child flows, those are not counted as part of your workflow count. So if you have an assembly that is one parent and two children, that's not three of your workflow instantiations on your premium plan. It's only one.
You got it. Exactly. It's so, and it seems to be in response to some kind of pushback about those premium pieces. That seems to be the compromise that's happened. And as you're doing searches for parent, even just to do a search for Power Automate parent-child flows, you should find a number of examples. It's become a very common pattern. And based on how common it is, that's where I made the assumption that this is no longer a premium feature as it was when this thing first rolled out.
Great, thanks.
Once it's all together, I can do the export. I can do, it'll basically run the checker on each of my pieces, and then it'll do a publish. But basically, you run the publish, it generates a zip file. At the other end, I go to my solution page and do an import, and at some point, those become available. It sometimes takes a while after the import is done, after the connections are created, for SharePoint and Flow to wire everything up. And so there was another example that I'd started today. We aren't going to go through sort of this example of getting it all set up and done, because even once you're done those steps, it's non-deterministic when it's actually be available to work. But that's basically the idea. And the other thing that's nice when it does get generated is I get a version number. So, and this is incremented, so that as I'm applying new versions to it or running my import to update, it will, apply some basic rules and automatically increment my versions as I'm publishing each subsequent version. And we can see there are also options for managed versus unmanaged, depending on whether I want to make tweaks in my next environment or not. But once that export basically happens, I get my zip file and I run the import from the tenant that I want to get the stuff installed to. The other things that I'll publish with this are really just kind of the basics around getting the list templates with PowerShell and then applying those. We talked about it briefly at the start. You'll see all those scripts in here also. So really when you're rolling out the solution, the first thing to do, get the lists and libraries recreated, drop the Excel file into the app files folder, and then import the solution, wire up the connections with the service account preferably, or your own if you just want to test and kick tires, and everything should start working, or at least you'll be able to start testing from there. That's solutions. When you create that new solution, the other things that you can do is to build a new publisher. If and this is sort of just an example, version 1000, it'll then create. If I'm building a new publisher, it is a good idea to give it a prefix that for example, your environment variables will be prefixed with. And in this case, it's basically some publisher name. The bottom part of this page would be if I'm also going to deploy my solutions into the marketplace, because they're so robust that you're comfortable with doing that. Always possible. You'll see there are a number of different things that you can package as one of these solutions. It becomes pretty powerful, and that includes Power Apps, Power Automate, includes forms, includes CDS data. It includes just about anything you could ever want to package as a solution, but not necessarily, it seems, the SharePoint lists and libraries that I might want to follow my workflow around, for example. Though I could have a flow that generates a list or a library and by manipulating base.
PNP is always good for that too.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. The PNP pieces. So general principles. Use a worksheet to figure out the parameters and calculation. You're going to start with ID and title plus your input and output variables. Figure out how to avoid your collisions if you think you might be in that case. SharePoint list item ID seems to work pretty well for things, but if two people happen to add it at the same time, you might want to add or concatenate an account name with that as well. But then think about how that's going to behave and making sure that if two people are really operating on the same item at the same time, is that going to be allowed, or do I need some other kind of rule in place? Should they be still working on the same row, but now I need to figure out how to get them to communicate somehow that, hey, when you were doing this, somebody else updated within 30 seconds, and you might want to double check that everything, the final values were what you expected them to be, as an example. And basically, once you have your calculations working right, and convert that into a table, and now you get that nice propagation where anytime a new row comes in, all the values come through. Some of these slides we don't have to dwell on too deeply. We've talked about just to be aware of them. Excel stores a number of dates in one weird format, and SharePoint likes to store them as relative to UTC or Greenwich Mean Time. So you're always going to need some little bit of ETL or extract, transform, and load between these systems. The nut of it is use the least ambiguous means possible when storing values in each of these systems. And just about every date function that you can use in either of these systems lets you choose your output format, and something fairly unambiguous looks like this. The other thing we looked in a little bit of detail was this checking for duplicates. This particular function, it's really just doing the conversion for if the event date equals the date that the user chose and the parent ID equals the ID of the list item, then we have a duplicate. And this is simply how we test for that. We walk through try catch finally. There's a few detailed steps on how to set up your own. And creating character items in Power Automate, something we didn't do, but this is also kind of good to know. These things do need start and end times. I promised that we would finish with Outlook. Just to see that Megan's calendar has Boxing Day on the 26th, and the stat holiday got pushed to the Monday. Look at that. So there we go. That holiday happened and everything is cool. So it's going to be the service account inviting users to this event. If I put everybody in there, it's going to show up in everybody's calendar. Think about that before you go and do it. But don't let that stop you. You know what I mean? Just be aware of where it's coming. But I don't want Eli to invite a bunch of people to all these vacation events. I want a service account to do it. And so it really is important that this runs in the context of that account. And especially when you're building this kind of stuff for clients or for your organization. The way that we create that is simply by, you have the start date. So basically we have an event date that we're working with here. and we're going to give it a UTC that's fairly late in the day. So when it does our offset of, -5 hours, we're still going to land on the same day. That's the whole goal of this. And I've just used times a little bit later in the day so that, again, even as it's not going to be offset, whether we're -5 from Greenwich mean or minus or on daylight savings time, it's still going to generally work out at different times a year. But this is also where it helps to do your calculations off of a run date that you can choose rather than just always using that today function, because you'll inevitably want to test all these different cases out. And that's about the scoop. So we're, if you have any other ideas to sort of things that could be added to the summary, Power Platform solutions are great. It's good to have a sense of what you're going into, have a plan for, storing and retrieving a configuration, and especially so that I have the least amount of wire up from environment to environment. And with Excel service, probably the best advice I can give you is plan to spend a lot of that time on ETL, because in my case, it was getting those dates to be absolutely perfect, and then daylight savings time happened, and a few of them seemed to be odd. So what was going on, and how to sort those things out. Depending on what kind of calculations you're doing, whether it's dates, whether it's currency, you're probably, hopefully your numbers and your other pieces are going to be a little easier to transform back and forth, but you never know. it's kind of the thing. Plan to spend a bit of time on that, and that's it. Thanks for coming out. We'll return to the top in case you wanted contact information or anything else. And if you have any questions, feel free. But that's the scoop today.
Very cool. Hadn't thought of using the online office as a service, but it makes a lot of sense.
Once you get past the part where it's like, okay, I've dealt with all the things that make me feel like I need to take a shower because
it doesn't feel right.
Something doesn't feel right. So they say like Excel contains 80% of the world's business logic, and I think that's only gone up maybe in value since Microsoft 365 came about.
There's a lot of business that runs on Excel.
And so, but by following the standard pattern, if your cases are, these cases are really complicated. I mean, like these calculations that I'm making are not a lot of fun, but the nice thing is that there's a lot of Excel MVPs and others like them who have formulas for just about anything under the sun. And it makes it very tempting when you're not treating this as a data store. You're just treating it as a calculation.
Engine. Yeah.
It's everything. It looks like a solution for a lot of things. And the same general pattern always works. And now I can have something that's probably simple enough to turn over to users at some level, at least to test, at least to tell me, here's what we think went wrong. I love it.
Cool. Other questions from the group as a whole before we wrap up?
And thanks so much for sticking around, and glad we recorded for everybody. I had to leave early.
Perfect. Well, Eli, I want to thank you very much. Our last session of 2020, we'll get it up on the YouTube channel, send a note out to the group. And I'm not sure, Lewis, do we have a speaker confirmed for January and topic at this point?
I've been speaking to a couple of people, one who has created a function in a Power Apps in order to print screens, and he's using, and I can't remember the name of the, I guess,
there's
Power Apps Foundation or something, or development.
No, there's like a client-side workflow piece now. So one of the new things we can create in here is a UI flow. So a UI flow lets me, if you think of like old macros, where open spreadsheet, move to cell, B3,
yeah, these are remote control, aren't they?
Yeah, it's this whole remote controlled script out. What you're doing with Excel or Word or anything else for that matter.
Now I want to have a shower. Sorry.
So I would suspect this may be a UI flow based trick. It's awesome.
Well, this was a C# code that it was deployed to Azure, and then it's run from within the Power App itself. So you create a UI, like a component. You created a button. The button is rendered within the C# code, and that button then does all the work in C# in the Azure cloud somehow. And we were talking about exporting to PDF. So I mean, this prints to to a printer, but it could just as easily have exported to any other format as well, right? But anyways, he showed me the whole solution. I thought, oh, this might be a decent topic. So he said, yeah, he'd like to talk about it. Of course, Hugo's also expressed some interest in doing some talk. So there's a couple of possibilities.
Okay. Well, Lewis, let me reach out outside of this and excuse me, connect up with you and Bill and Roy, and let's figure out sort of the plan in the new year. I've got a bunch of ideas I've been meeting to chat with you guys on, but I don't want to hold people longer from here. So, appreciate everybody. Sorry. Coming out tonight virtually, and hopefully sometime in 2021 we can be back to an in-person event. We'll see how it all plays out.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Stay safe till then, and have great holidays, everybody. Happy Kwanzaa, Christmas, Hanukkah, whatever you're celebrating.
Absolutely.
Hope you have a good one.
Thanks, Eli. Bye now.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Luis.
Thank you.
And thank you, Bill.